Okay, welcome to part 3. This is part 3 where we have an instrument change, where we're going to look at something other than this. This is a very conventional, traditional instrument. It's a great instrument. It drives me a little nuts, I have to say, because it's really hard. I mean, all instruments are hard, but this one is hard, and everybody knows what it's supposed to sound like, and I suffer from all kinds of self-loathing and uncertainty. Okay, but this is not a therapy session for me. So let's talk about how the instrument that I'm going to show you contrasts this, how it's something that's really different, and how that actually is really engaging to me. And it actually makes me like this instrument more. What is that? Well, that's this sound sculpture that I invented. I call it the Mousketier. That's tiers, like layers, T-I-E-R. Also, you know, then there will not be like some sort of corporate litigation against me. But the point is that this is an invented instrument. It's a one-of-a-kind instrument, and as you can see, it's quite a bit different than this one. And I like playing the piano because then it's like different than the Mousketier. I like playing the Mousketier because it's different than the piano. They're just both really interesting to me. So the Mousketier is built out of junk and hardware and found objects mounted on electroacoustic soundboards. And by electroacoustic soundboards, I mean I've got all this junk and stuff affixed to the soundboards, and then I have these little piezo contact pickups. They cost like $1 or something, and they're affixed to them, and they pick up the vibrations in the soundboard that are communicated to the soundboard through the things that I'm striking and plucking and bowing. By the way, I play this with my hands. I play this with chopsticks and wind-up toys and knitting needles and violin bows and bits of Lego toy and whatever I can find. So it's really fun to search for things, objects that you can mount on your soundboards and things you can play them with. In any case, those things vibrate, and the vibrations go through the soundboard. They go into the piezo contact pickups, and then I can wire them to like a guitar amplifier or a PA system, and I can make those little tiny sounds really come alive, make them really big, so that there's a kind of intimate quality to them. But then they can really roar, of course, with a sound system. I should also say that this is actually an acoustic instrument. If the power goes out, I can still play a gig, although not for too many people because it's pretty quiet. But I can pluck around on the nails, and I can rotate the squeaky wheels, and I can play the chopsticks on the threaded rods, and there are door stops, these springs that I can bend over and they flip, and you hear all these things. Of course, when I amplify them, then they sound cool in a different way, and they sound very, very big. And then I have a whole bunch of live electronics, different, kind of like guitar pedal type things, like where I can add echo and reverberation and change the pitch and do all sorts of other things. And that's a lot of fun, and that doesn't require the electricity. Okay, so here's another picture. There's a side view, and you can see I've got parts from a toilet tank flotation system in the United States. I've got like bronze brazing rod, stuff that a welder would use and to meld two pieces of metal together. I use that and I bend it with a blowtorch in interesting shapes. They make these wild gong-like sounds. There are springs stretched, and I can stroke them, or I can strike them, or I can pick them up and let them snap back against the instrument, kind of like a Bartok pizzicato on a violin. I've got combs. All the combs that I own are permanently affixed to my sound sculptures. And I have AstroTurf and nails of different size and gauge pounded into the instrument at different lengths, so those give me different pitches. And again, as I mentioned, sometimes I go to gigs with a whole rack of electronics, what we call live electronics. And in concert, I can amplify the instrument sort of plainly and just hear the sound of the nail being plucked, or a string being scraped, or a comb, the teeth of combs being stroked. Or I can send those sounds through various processors, and we can hear what they sound like with this kind of electronic modification. I have an arrow pointing to a nail, and I'd like to play an example of what that nail sounds like when I pluck it with my finger. Okay, this is what that nail sounds like. Yeah, that was it. Okay, let's hear it again, because it's just so great. I think it's great. You're deeply alienated, and you've turned off the computer. And see, I can say this now because the computer's off. So okay. And here's the nail again. Let's hear it being plucked. Okay. Now over here, I have another sound example. This time with some of the electronic manipulation. So it's going to be the same pluck, but you're going to hear a whole bunch of other crazy sounds. Here we go. Yeah, believe it or not, that's just the same pluck. But I set up my electronics to do all these kind of weird sorts of things. make a whole kind of almost phrase or with a little gesture out of that one pluck. This one is even more elaborate. Listen to this, same thing, a pluck. Did it sound kind of similar? It's because I played the wrong thing. I played the same one. It wasn't more elaborate. Okay, let me see if I can get my pointer on my laptop to the right place. Okay, that's precisely the same thing. That's not helping. Why is it not? Okay. This is one of those technical things that you just hate to happen. I'm going to change to something else. I'm going to bow that nail. Let's hear the nail being bowed. Okay, so this is like a small scale, like a beginner little kid practice violin bow. And if you could, I don't know if you can make this out in the video, but some of those nails are kind of white as the consequence of rosin being left on the nails. Okay, so here is the nail being bowed. And then let's listen to the bow being nailed again, the nail being bowed. Yeah, I think that's right. But let's hear it with all sorts of electronic transformations and mutations. Now, that's nothing like this. And that's a good thing. You know, I mean, it's the reason why we have orchestras made up of different timbres. And I'm just kind of extending my orchestra, okay? And inventing new instruments that give me new timbres and new sounds. And for me, that's really fun. I still want to play this instrument. I like it. I like the discipline associated with it. But I like inventing new instruments. And I like the discipline associated with inventing and playing new instruments. I'm going to say some more about that. But first, let me stroke those nails with a chopstick. So I'm sort of stroking the nails downward, and let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, that's great. And now let's hear it modified with electronics. Again, if you think about it, I said to you just a moment ago that I like the sound of the piano, and I like the sound of my sound sculpture, the Mousketier. And there's a time for each. Similarly, I like the sound of the stroked nails like this, without modification, and there's some musical context where I want this place. Okay? Let's rotate some of those squeaky wheels. First, we're going to hear a low wheel, then a high wheel. Yeah, that's beautiful to me. I can't live without that. I mean, I like violins, I like flutes, but I also really like this. Okay, let's hear those squeaky wheels rotated again with some electronic modification. Yeah, okay. I entertain myself. That should be evident already. Now let's hear the teeth of the combs being stroked with my thumbs, okay? Here are the combs. Let's listen to this. And now a modified version. And now let's put this whole thing together as a kind of a musical line, almost a kind of timbre melody. And what we're going to hear is that first the nail being plucked, then we're going to hear the row of nails being stroked, then we're going to hear the wheels, low and high wheels, and then finally the teeth of the combs. Let's listen to that as a kind of musical phrase. And now with some of the electronic processing that I can choose spontaneously. By the way, I use this as an improvisational tool. I improvise on this in concert, sometimes solo, sometimes with other people. This is not an instrument that's developed mostly to write strict, formal, determinate, more or less always the same kind of pieces. This is kind of like my approach to jazz piano, where I'm going to vary it every time. So similarly, I kind of vary it every time. And sometimes I play it just like you heard it, and sometimes I might play that same phrase and it will sound like this, because I could choose spontaneously to invoke some electronics. That's not what I want to do. Here we go. Here was the modified version. So that's a situation where, you know, there's the same phrase again, but modified. I hope that's clear, okay? It's really fun. You gotta go to the garage and find things and tinker around with it. You know, when I first went to hardware stores and junkyards and things like that, but mostly hardware stores, to find some things, the clerks were they're pretty nervous, and they sort of eyed me with suspicion. But after a few visits, it turned into this kind of informal arts outreach program where they were like super excited. They're like, Mark, last night we found this, you can hit it this way, or this tool does this, and that was a lot of fun. Okay, so this is an instrument that I invented. It's one of many instruments that I have invented, and I call it a sound sculpture because I intended as kind of interesting visual art. It should look arresting, and it should have amazing timbral, tone color possibilities. And it should definitely be fun to play. All right, now it is fun to play, and one of the great fun things, and it's something I want you to know, is that I am in fact the world's best Mousketier player. There is no finer player in the world. All right, that sounds incredibly arrogant and narcissistic, and it is, okay, but it's also true, because I'm the only player. There's only one Mousketier. But what that means, and this is the more important thing that I want to tell you, and it's the more important thing that I know about myself, and that is that I'm also the world's worst Mousketier player. I am simultaneously the best and the worst at this particular instrument. That's quite a bit different than this instrument. I will never be the best or the world's worst pianist, okay? I'm somewhere in the middle of that huge continuum of maybe 1 billion people or something who play the piano. I exaggerate, but only a little maybe. So, that creates an interesting opportunity and dilemma, as does my best and worst status as a practitioner, as a player of the Mousketier. Now, why is this valuable and this important to me? Okay, first of all, I want to point out that the piano is a culture that is generations, hundreds of years old, and it involves many, many players, as I've mentioned, and it spans a lot of different genres. It has a lot of history. We understand what it means to be a beginning piano player. We understand what it might sound like to be an intermediate player. We know what an advanced player would sound like. And moreover, we understand the kind of questions and the kind of techniques that are involved in moving from a beginning to an intermediate to an advanced status. We have an idea about what kind of schooling and teachers you might involve. We have an idea about what kinds of things you might do to progress, all right? Whether it's alone or with some sort of mentor. With the Mousketier, what are the rules? What's a good sounding Mousketier player? If I play a doorstop, or I stroke a spring, or I play the squeaky wheels, was it a good squeaky wheel articulation or not a good squeaky wheel articulation? When you draw a bow across a violin, for the most part, in a kind of classical, Western, Eurocentric musical context, we know kind of what a good violin tone is. What's a good squeaky wheel tone, okay? So that's part of the dilemma of being the worst player, is that it tells me that I must be, by definition, a beginner. If I'm the worst player in the world, I must be a beginner. And I have to think about how I'm going to progress from a beginning state to an intermediate and hopefully one day an advanced state of the art. What is the state of the art in a culture of one, in a culture that only involves me? Okay, so this is the kind of challenge. I don't know what kind of teachers I should have on a Mousketier, since I'm the only player. I don't know what the questions are. In fact, I do know about how to teach myself, and I do know what some of the questions are. And that's because I've thought of it as a discipline. I wasn't satisfied to just take the Mousketier and say, look, I made this cool thing. I can make this, and I can bring it on stage, and people are like, wow, that's really cool. You've got one of those. You've got one of those. I mean, can you imagine going on stage and saying, I have one of these, it's a clarinet, and expecting applause? No, people don't care if you own a clarinet. They want to know, what can you do with it? What can you say with it? What kinds of thoughts and feelings can you convey through it? And they know a little bit about what good clarinet playing might sound like. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to play the clarinet, but we kind of have an idea about if it's like successful or not. But how do people know, again, with a doorstop or a squeaky wheel? All right, so I'm not satisfied with just that kind of thing where I can show up and say I've got this really cool, weird-looking thing. I actually want to remind myself that I'm the worst at this. This is actually a really healthy and ultimately happy designation for me, okay? And it pushes me to be disciplined and to think about those questions, which at first were very vague to me, but now I kind of understand. I have a sense about what good squeaky wheel playing is and what it isn't, okay? And I think that audiences actually respond to that. They haven't thought about it if they're new to my instrument, but somehow they can hear that I've spent a lot of time practicing this thing, and I know my way around it, and I know how to get certain kinds of squeaks, and I know how to combine it with the electronics in interesting ways and so forth. So the point is, there is in fact a discipline, an invention of a discipline in an unconventional space. So we talked about conventional spaces in the last segment of this video, where, you know, we thought about, like, I have to be disciplined at the piano, which is a conventional instrument, in a conventional idiom, which is to say jazz. I mean, more or less a conventional idiom. But Mousketierism is not a conventional idiom, and the Mousketier is not a conventional instrument. And there are no exemplars other than me. So I have to really invent that whole space. So this is something I encourage my students in California to innovate, to try new things. But I'm not content with them to just sort of try it as a kind of glib, cavalier experiment. I want them to actually invent the thing, experiment, and then take it to the next level. Take it a few more levels, really get into it and think about how to develop that thing, okay? So that's something I want to say. We all understand, you know, how you want to be expert in this instrument, and we kind of understand what expert would mean. But try to be expert in your new innovative technology, as it were. And by the way, that can be a musical instrument. That can be a new way of doing something in some other field. It could be about the invention of any kind of thing. So something you might want to think about. So this is something where it engages new forms. So it's not traditional forms that we're engaging, but it still invites rigor. It still invites, I have to practice the Mousketier all the time. I'm gonna tell you something else. I started inventing instruments in 1990 when I was a graduate student. And I invented a whole bunch of instruments, about one a year, and I'd work on these things. In 2001, I invented the Mousketier. Today, it's 2015, and the Mousketier is my most recent instrument. You might think, like, have you been, like, just lazy? You haven't invented a new instrument in the last 14 years? In fact, I've been, in some ways, the opposite of lazy. I've really pushed myself to not invent a new instrument so that I could learn how to play this one that I've made. So the project in the last 14 years has been to try to really get better at the Mousketier and to not spend my time inventing a new instrument until I feel like I'm a little more accomplished. By the way, update, little coda on this story. I now feel that I'm an intermediate Mousketier player. Someday I hope to be advanced. All right, so that's a little bit about a new instrument and a little bit about how I think about discipline in a new cultural space. We're gonna come back with part 4, and I wanna talk about a piece for hand gestures synchronized to sound that involves a different kind of discipline. Okay, see you then.